You know, we've all been there. You make a deal, you shake on it, maybe you even sign a contract, and then poof, it all falls apart. The other person bails, or some wild event just blows up the whole plan. So what happens then? Well, believe it or not, the answers were actually hammered out over 150 years ago in court cases about stuff like burning buildings and canceled royal parades. And those old rules, they still run our world today. So let's dive in and figure out what happens when a promise gets broken. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the basic problem, contracts going wrong. Then I'll give you the secret weapon lawyers use to analyze these things. It's called IRAC. After that, we'll use that tool to look at the impossible promise and then the premature I quit. And to wrap it all up, we'll see why these old cases are still so incredibly important. I mean, this is the big one, right? This is the fundamental question. And it's not just about, hurt feelings or being let down. It's about fairness, it's about money, and it's about who ends up taking the loss. Literally our entire economy, from you renting an apartment to a massive corporate merger, it all depends on having a clear, predictable answer to this question. Okay, so how do lawyers and judges actually find that clear answer? They don't just wing it, that's for sure. They use a really structured, logical method to cut through the noise and get right to the heart of the problem. And now we're going to put that exact same tool in your hands. It's called the IRAC framework. Now, it sounds a little technical, I know, but honestly, you can just think of it as a secret decoder ring for any legal problem. It's a super simple 4-step process that helps you take a messy, real-world situation and turn it into a clear, logical, legal argument. It's awesome. So here are the 4 steps. IRAC. First step, I is for issue. What's the real legal question we need to answer? Next, R is for rule. What's the law or the legal principle that applies here? Then you've got A for application. This is the key part, where you connect the specific facts of your situation to that rule. And finally, C for conclusion. What's the answer? It's simple, it's powerful, and we're about to put it to work. All right, let's kick things off with our first big theme. What happens when a deal becomes impossible, not because somebody got cold feet, but because the world itself, the universe, just intervenes? A natural disaster, a freak accident, something that makes the deal physically impossible to complete. Okay, so for our first case, picture this. The year is 1863. A concert promoter has a plan for 4 huge concerts at this amazing venue, the Surrey Gardens Music Hall. He's hired the hall, he's started selling tickets, and then, just a few days before the very first show, the entire music hall burns to the ground. Total disaster. Let's run this through our IRAC framework. The issue here is pretty clear. Does the venue owner have to pay the promoter for all the money he's about to lose? Well, the court came up with a new rule called the doctrine of implied condition. It basically says some things are so obvious they don't have to be written down, like, for instance, the fact that the music hall has to actually exist for a concert to happen there. So the application is this. When the hall burned down, that unspoken condition was broken by fate, not by either person. And that leads to the conclusion. The contract is just gone. It's discharged. Nobody's at fault, and both parties just have to walk away and deal with their own losses. All right, so that's what happens when the thing in the contract is destroyed. But what if the thing is still there, but the entire reason for it has vanished? 40 years later, a new case pops up. A guy rents a fancy apartment in London for 2 days. He pays a crazy high price, but it's got a perfect front row view of the coronation parade for King Edward VII. There's just one tiny problem. The king gets appendicitis, and the whole coronation is postponed. So does the renter still have to cough up the cash for the room? Let's use IRAC. The issue. Can a contract be canceled if its entire purpose just disappears? The court came up with another brand new rule, the doctrine of frustration of purpose. Now look at the application, because this is the important part. Sure, the room was still there. He could have stayed in it. But the one and only reason for the contract, the whole point of it, was to watch that parade. Since the parade was gone, the purpose was, frustrated. And that led to the conclusion, yep, the contract is voided. The renter was totally off the hook.
Okay, let's pause here because this is such a critical difference. In the first case, Taylor, it was about physical impossibility. The thing was gone. You literally cannot hold a concert in a pile of ashes. But in the second case, Krell, performance was still possible, but the entire point was gone. It's the thing is gone versus the point is gone. And that little distinction is the foundation for how we handle everything today, from canceled weddings to postponed sporting events.
All right, so that's what happens when fate throws a wrench in the works. But what if the problem isn't some act of God? What if it's just a person?
What happens when someone says, hey, I know we have a deal for next month, but I'm backing out right now? Do you really have to just sit around and wait for that date to arrive before you can do anything?
Well, this brings us to a case from 1853, Hoster v. Delator. So a guy named Hoster gets hired to be a courier for a 3-month grand tour of Europe. Sounds like a great gig. But more than a month before the tour is even supposed to start, his new boss, Delator, sends him a letter that basically says, yeah, never mind, I've changed my plans, don't need you. Now, check out this timeline. The job gets canceled on May 11th. Hochter turns around and sues just 11 days later, on May 22nd. That's way before the tour's original start date of June 1st. And Delator's argument was pretty simple. Hey, how can you sue me for breaking the contract? It hasn't even started yet. You have to wait until June 1st. Does that sound fair to you? Time to pull out our IRAC toolkit again. The issue: can you actually sue before the contract's official start date? The court's answer created a landmark rule we now call the doctrine of anticipatory breach. It says that when one person makes it absolutely positively clear they are not going to hold up their end of the bargain, the other person doesn't have to just sit on their hands and wait. Delator's letter was a crystal clear application of that. So the conclusion was a huge yes. Hochter could sue right away. And this just makes sense, right? It lets the person who got wronged go out and find another job, instead of being stuck in limbo. Okay, so a letter saying I'm backing out is pretty straightforward. But what if the person doesn't say anything at all? What if their actions are what make the contract impossible? Well, that takes us to an even earlier case, Lovelock v. Franklin, which tackled that exact question. So in this one, a guy named Franklin agreed to sell a piece of land to Lovelock. But before the deadline for the sale, he went and sold that same piece of land to somebody else. So the issue is that an immediate breach, even though he didn't say anything. The rule the court established is that yes, an anticipatory breach can happen through your actions. The application here is undeniable. By selling the land, Franklin made it impossible for him to ever sell it to Lovelock. The conclusion? His actions spoke louder than words. It was an immediate breach of contract, plain and simple. You know, the judge in that Hochter case really summed it all up perfectly with this quote. It's all about fairness and just common sense. If you're the one who breaks the promise, you can't turn around and complain about getting sued right away. The damage was done the second you decided to back out of the deal. So we've talked about burning music halls, canceled coronations, and people quitting jobs before they even start. I know it all sounds like something out of a dusty old history book, right? But the legal ideas that came out of these stories are without a doubt the bedrock of our entire modern economy. Just think about it for a second. Every time a concert gets canceled because of a hurricane, that's Taylor v. Caldwell at work. When a global pandemic makes a business trip completely pointless, that's Crowell v. Henry. When a supplier emails you to say they won't have your parts ready for next month's project, boom, that's Hoster for Delator. These aren't just old cases. They are literally the operating system for modern business. And if you think this is some small niche area of the law, get this. In many places, over 90% of all civil lawsuits are about contract disputes. Every single one of them, in one way or another, relies on the logic that was forged in these 19th century courtrooms. What a few judges decided way back then has a direct impact on millions of deals every single year. It's staggering. And all of this kind of leaves us with one final big question to think about. We always think of a contract as being about the promise itself. But maybe its real power, its true value, isn't in the promise, but in the clear, predictable roadmap it gives us for what to do when that promise, inevitably, gets broken. Something to chew on. Thanks for tuning in.